Welcome back to the Y-Intercept. This week we are talking about this idea of trendsetters, the people who forge a different path, but then that path ends up becoming the popular path, in which case the thing that made them unique is not that thing anymore. This applies to all areas of life, and not just in relation to fashion and style, because do we ever talk about anything so unilaterally in this podcast, but in the way that behaviors of a minority group end up convincing this majority group to jump ship and follow suit. So this can apply to business, it can apply to politics, you get the picture. And this might apply to your own life in both the positive pursuit of that outcome or the negative pursuit of that outcome. So we need to understand how and why it happens. I'm your host, Samita Kathari. I have a degree in cognitive science with a concentration in neuroscience from the University of California, Berkeley. I worked at Google and then I worked at Stripe, and I ultimately don't think any of those are reasons that you should listen to me. I think you should make up your mind for yourself. If there was one reason that I had, it is because I am currently on the pursuit of attempting to make highly individualistic, expressive, upcycled pieces accessible more broadly, and it's a weird enough goal that I end up in all these situations that have made me question just about everything. So that is the why behind these whys. And with that, I welcome you to the Y-Intercept. So trendsetting. The reason that I'm asking this question is because, as I've articulated before, I have a really high need for uniqueness. When I signed my offer letter at Google, the first thing that I did was open up another tab and click purchase on this pair of bright red booties that were fully sequined, cuff to toe, and they are stunning. If you're watching the video version of this, you're in for a treat because I'm gonna hold them up. Absurd. Insane. They are crazy. I love having something that's funky enough and weird enough that it breaks the ice, and it did that. On the first day, the number of conversations I had were people in this technical program who very much did not expect to have someone in their midst wearing something so audacious. It was such a wonderful way to meet people. Putting myself out there like that is actually one of the most comfortable ways in which I move through the world. And by extension, the opposite of that, which would be blending in, is something that actually comes quite effortfully. But here's the thing. It actually might not benefit me to be a trendsetter because I don't like people copying me. Side note, this part of the story is going to sound like shade, and I really don't mean it to be, but I share it to paint a picture. In this same time period of my life, I ended up living with a roommate who was copying a lot of the things that I was doing, not just with clothes, but the rug that I would buy for my room or where I would hang my pictures. It really started to freak me out. I ended up calling up my friend Sydney and having her walk me off the ledge, which is ridiculous, right? And yet some of us have a really difficult time with other people copying us. It's this thing called identity threat, and it feels super uncomfortable. But that points to kind of the opposite of trend setting, right? So we first have to understand what kinds of people want to look different. There's so many different factors that can go into it. One is culture. In Western culture, there's certainly a type of expressiveness that's appreciated. It's very different in Eastern countries that have a higher emphasis on conformity. But that's not the only factor. There's a couple other that I found. And one of them is called high desire for control. It's this measure by which certain people have the need to feel in control of a situation or are significantly motivated to feel in control of the events in their life. And as defined by the original researchers Berger and Cooper in 1979, they measured this low versus high desire of control by examining individual differences in the extent to which people prefer to see themselves in control. So this had a lot of implications on things like anxiety, depression, voting behavior, a whole host of attributes that they reference in their study. So Berger went on to research this high desire for control versus low desire for control behavior in relation to academic performance, achievement-related behaviors, interaction style, etc. When it came to academic performance, he found that people with high desire for control generally performed better. Over a 2-year period, about 85% of the students over 3.0 were the ones who had high desire for control. And similarly, he found that in relation to achievement-related behaviors, subjects that were high in their desire for control displayed higher levels of aspiration, had higher expectations for their performances, and were able to set their expectations in a more realistic manner than subjects with low desire for control. When it came to interpersonal interaction, which is how we interact with our peers, Berger found that subjects with low desire for control ended up initiating more of their daily conversations and enjoyed those interactions more than people with high desire for control. With all of these things, there's a trade-off. But what I found really interesting was desire for control was studied in conjunction with conformity. In one of the experiments, Berger, who was the researcher, ended up having subjects evaluate how funny these series of cartoons were, but he had a paid actor stand in and laugh at some of them and not laugh at the others, particularly the ones that were deemed just objectively not funny, to then quantify how persuaded certain individuals would be to also laugh or not laugh, i.e. conform to this idea of humor even if they may not have had it for themselves. And what he found was people with high desire for control were significantly less likely to conform, and people with low desire for control were much more likely to conform to the presence of this actor's sense of humor. Now, he eliminated the actor, and he just indicated on these cartoons which ones had been rated as more funny by this third party that wasn't physically present, because he wanted to control for the fact that sometimes we feel an additional pressure when there's literally the presence of someone right there in the room with us. And what he found was the same results. People with low desire for control were still more likely to conform to the indications of humor by another party, even if they weren't present, whereas people with high desire for control were less likely to conform. So this is a really interesting metric on which we have a facet of individual behavior that indicates why someone might be less likely to conform, and through those non-conforming behaviors might do something like dress totally off trend. But that's not the only one I want to talk about, because I discovered this thing called Reactance Theory, which, oh my gosh, just set off so many light bulbs in my head, because one, I'm embarrassed by the fact that I can conjure up so many personal examples of where I have certainly behaved in this manner. But two, it ties into this concept of mimetic desire, which, if you're not familiar with previously, we're going to explore it again, but through this frame of reference. Reactance theory is this idea that we will sometimes behave in a way that's not actually the way we want to, but more out of a resistance to have other people control our behavior. A really good example of this is banned books. Like when we tell people those books are banned and you can't read them, out of simple reactance of people feeling like their freedom has been threatened, it literally spurs this demand for banned books. People go, actually, you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to go read that book. And the thing is, people might not have wanted to read that book, but because they were told they can't do it, now all of a sudden, they really want to do it. Reactance theory ties into all of this is because just like everything else, some of us have a higher and lower threshold at which we resist this pressure to conform. I know for myself, for instance, that as soon as anybody tells me you can't do something, I have to do it. And in both ways, as argued by Jonah Berger, who is the author of Invisible Influence, you are still kind of conforming. You are changing your behavior in accordance with or in reaction to a specific group. Hear me out. There's this distinction between normative behaviors and conforming behaviors, which this is so smart. God, I love social science. Normative behavior is when we do something that the rest of the group does because it's the normal thing to do. It's something like wearing clothes. We do this, one, because it's what the rest of the group is doing, but two, because inherently we feel pretty aligned with it. Like that's just normal behavior. The difference between normative behavior and conforming behavior is the idea of doing what the group is doing, even when you might not inherently align with the ideology of the behaviors you're conforming to, but you go along with it to match the behaviors of others. This is like when you join a sorority, for instance, and now all of a sudden you're wearing a specific thing, you're chanting X, Y, and Z, and oh my gosh, that is not a normal thing to do. And yet you're doing the same thing as this whole other group of people. Why? I don't know, because one, you're insane. Two, it was actually the cheaper option for housing at Berkeley. And three, because it's conforming behavior. Now, thinking about conforming behaviors, that stems a lot more emotionally from this desire to fit in or this desire to be liked or this fear of being rejected. It is influenced much more by this idea of the in-group than something like a social norm. And the reason why we're clarifying conformity versus normative behavior is when we go back to reactance theory and why behaving in a certain way out of reaction to something else is a conforming behavior, it's because it might not be the behavior that we actually wanted to do. We're just conforming to the opposite of whatever that conforming behavior was. An example of this is teenage rebellion. When your parents tell you you can't go to that party, you sneak out, you take the car, and you go to the party anyway. Here's the thing. If they didn't tell you you couldn't go to the party, you might actually just want to stay at home and watch a movie. That's the third option. But because you're acting out of reactance, of course, you're not doing that third option. You're not doing the behavior you might actually want to do. You're not acting with full agency. You're just acting in a way that's responding to either the conformity or the counterconformity. I want to tie this into mimetic theory. Mimetic desire, just as a ground level reset, is this idea that we copy the desires of the people that we look up to, such as, oh, that high-performing coworker of mine just got a Tesla. I think I want a Tesla too now all of a sudden. It's really subconscious, and yet it happens all the time. It's something that oftentimes sets up the foundations for our desires when we're younger, based off of role models like our parents or our teachers, or other people on books, movies, TV shows that feel aspirational. In the book Wanting by Luke Burgess, which is the book I read on mimetic desire, he brings up this concept of anti-mimetic desire, or anti-mimesis, which is that oftentimes in reaction to people that we don't like, we might end up not desiring the things that they desire. So for instance, say there's this person you really don't like and all they drink is Dunkin' Donuts. Well, subconsciously, without even realizing it, you might be someone who will never touch Dunkin' Donuts. And it might be something you can't even articulate. You don't know why. But subconsciously, because you really don't want to associate or identify with any attribute of that person, you internalize not having the same desires. This plays out hugely when it comes to fashion and style. The amount of times where you hear of someone who has been canceled and now all of a sudden you're not going to touch their aesthetic with a 10-foot pole. For instance, Elizabeth Holmes, she's someone who famously only wore black turtlenecks. Why? Because she was an admirer of Steve Jobs, who only wore black turtlenecks. And yet, Elizabeth Holmes created this company that was a total sham called Theranos, and essentially, if I remember correctly, entirely faked its ability to be able to help people determine their blood types. Tons of funding was poured into this company, it was a massive scandal, and now I would be pressed to believe that people are equally as likely to wear black turtlenecks as a signature style as they would have been before she came around. So that's an example of anti-mimetic desire, but also an example of reactance theory. The takeaway for all of this is that we have certain drives within us, be it desire for control or our level of reaction, and these aren't the only two, but I think that they provide a good baseline. Okay, so now that we've established why certain people might be more likely to be in the minority group, we get to think about why the minority group might sometimes bring the majority group along with them. And this is something called minority influence, which is so well researched. Whenever I find something like this, it is such a gold mine because I realize how many of these same questions that I am asking other people have asked. And all it's left to do is put it together in a way that answers the questions in relation to our specific point in time and the context in which we're now reinvestigating all of this. So minority influence is this idea that minority groups can often have a really big influence on the majority groups in a way that can be persuasive and bring the majority along with them. Really clear examples of this are during the Civil Rights Movement. In Alabama, in the 1960s, when African Americans began to boycott buses, all of a sudden what started as a small group of individuals ended up crossing this threshold at which it ended up changing the behavior of the majority group. And that is so powerful. So what are the conditions under which minority influence can have that effect? Here's what was found. There's a study done by a researcher with the surname Ash in 1951 in which he showed his subjects a single black straight line, and then he showed them 3 other lines of varying heights and asked them to pick which one was the same length as the first one he showed them. But he filled the room with a bunch of paid actors that picked the wrong length line just to see how the subject would respond when pressured by this group majority. And what he found was that on at least one trial, 75% of these male subjects all gave the conforming answer, which was the wrong answer. And that was this basis for a lot of our research around conformity and nonconformity. So it's a really hallmark study. Ash, 1951. So based off of this, a bunch of researchers then started to question, hold on, that's the majority, but how are we influenced sometimes by the minority? And under this context, they did a whole different series of experiments. One of the most prominent researchers on the extension of this around minority influence was a gentleman with the surname Moscovici. And in one of his experiments, he showed a bunch of individuals slides on a projector that were all varying shades of blue. He showed them one after the other and he asked them, hey, what color are these slides? But he had 2 paid actors come in, the minority, and consistently answer in that group that each slide was green. And he found that compared to the control, in which 0.25% of subjects ever perceived one of the slides as green, in the test case in which he had 2 paid actors come in, almost 8.5% of individuals ended up saying that the slides were green, which is a massive difference. But he then repeated the experiment, and this time he had the actors sometimes switch whether they said the slides were blue or whether they said the slides were green. And the reason that he did this is because he wanted to test for whether people would still conform their behavior if they suspected that the 2 people answering might not be that confident or sure of themselves or rooted in reality, kind of any of those things. And what he found was the inconsistency ended up dropping that conformity down to only 1.25%. So this time in the test case, in this majority group who were paired with the actors who were inconsistent ended up not really conforming their beliefs in such a significant way as to whether these slides were blue or whether these slides were green. So the way that Moscovici boiled it down as to how the minority might have an influence was according to 3 factors. 1, their ability to come off as confident. 2, their ability to come off as realistic. And 3, their ability to maintain a consistent position. Which makes us think about this example of Kanye. As described by Drew Joyner in his video, Kanye is oftentimes perceived as a trendsetter. But why might Kanye be a trendsetter? Well, if we break it down on these 3 factors, he certainly nails them. 1, he's extremely confident in the things that he puts out into the world, especially when they're different and they're wacky. He very much stands behind his own personal aesthetic, and that level of confidence oftentimes brings us along with him. 2, being consistency is something that he certainly does really well. As much as his styles have changed, they stay enough for the majority to adopt his influence, at which point he evolves to the next thing and we follow him along with that. Now, this third thing being reality is interesting because currently Kanye is described as someone who has totally lost his marbles. And we see this affect his ability to be trend-setting. Previously, even though Kanye was different, he was still rooted in some element of reality that we could all grasp, and therefore, he was able to push these very innovative types of fashion out onto the market and land these massive brand deals with Gap and Adidas and whoever else knows, because honestly, I don't really follow Kanye. But now that the world perceives him as slightly less realistic, he's lost a lot of those brand deals, and it's harder for the majority to now follow his minority influence. But he's a really interesting example. So what can you do with all of this? It makes you think about whether in certain instances you want to set the trend or whether you might not want anyone to copy you. When it comes to certain phrases like imitation is flattery or imitation is suicide, I very much, as described by earlier stories, align with the latter. It wouldn't benefit me to consistently only wear individually expressive things, and it wouldn't benefit me to be super confident in that one identity. The fact that I switch off back and forth, either wearing this white tank and Lululemons or wearing something totally outlandish, has almost been this protection, which I imagine I might have derived subconsciously to prevent other people from seeing consistency and confidence and perhaps some level of realisticness in the way that I dress and therefore copy me. Now, I know that that might sound extreme, and I think that I have a lot of unpacking to do in therapy, but I share all this because I think that it can help us think about how we might want to be a trendsetter or not be a trendsetter in our own capacity. So now that we've put so much brain power towards self-expression, I want to wrap up with this one last thought. It's going to seem disconnected, but it's going to come back around. We basically have two competing forces here, right? The desire to fit in and the desire to stand out. I happened across this piece of writing by a gentleman named Tom Oliver, where he talks about the concept of self-expression in relation to conformity and group dynamics and individual dynamics, and he explains it as such. Insofar as we have the desire to fit in and the desire to stand out. The desire to fit in is the one that benefits the group. It's the one that helps us collaborate with each other and help the group be successful. The desire to stand out, however, is the one that allows us to break off from the group and become successful in our own individual right. It is the one that is more self-serving and self-oriented type of behavior. And that makes sense. We fit in so that we can be cooperative and help the group, but then we stand out so that we can help ourselves. I think that there's nuance because I think that when you go pursue your individualistic pursuit, oftentimes you discover or create things that end up helping the group for future generations. The reason that I bring up that nuance is because in his book, he makes this argument that the concept of self-identity is something that wasn't quite as prevalent even a couple hundred years ago as it is now in a way that is only continuing to increase. People back in the old days wouldn't have 100 outfit changes in a day, whereas now that might be typical for, say, the average teenager. And the argument that he makes is that this shift that our society has been making towards a greater emphasis on self-identity is one that is maladapted, is one that might be problematic because it shifts our thinking from more community-oriented behavior to behavior that is more self-serving and individualistic. And the reason that this struck a chord with me is because I so quickly saw my confirmation bias jump in and think, oh yeah, this whole expression thing is a little frivolous. It may be kind of a new thing. Fashion might not be all that necessary. Reading through his theories, it made a lot of sense to me as culturally, I come from a family that has really strong focus on things like math and science because those are really pragmatic. There was very little focus, if any at all, around aesthetics and expression and the validity of it because those weren't considered realistically practical needs. I think that the reason it was that way and is that way for a lot of cultures and is now shifting is it wasn't really possible to enjoy artistic pastimes or to express yourself in a multitude of ways. A big reason as to why I've been learning so much about this is this whole awareness is really frankly new to me. I decided to do a little bit of research into this, and the reason that I bring this up is because I do think that the trajectory that he notes is valid. I just think that the conclusion is worth reevaluating because we might come to find that we're actually living at a time in which we are presented with a very unique opportunity. So when I did some research as to this idea of self-expression, and particularly with clothing, it is something that we've had since ancient times. In fact, as referenced by Plato, this idea of clothing and beauty and fraud and all of the things that come with it has been around since the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks. It's the ways in which they would denote their social standing or show how much wealth they had. And this is something that we saw in medieval times as well, with the types of colors that people of upper class were allowed to wear. People of lower class had to wear muted colors. And we saw it in Baroque times with the ostentatious displays of wealth. So this isn't something that is only new to the current day and age, even though it is true we do have more access to it now than ever before. The interesting thing that I did look into, however, was this idea of self-expression. Self-expression has been a really core facet of the human condition long before ancient times. The ways in which we would express ourselves, however, were through means that were more accessible back then, such as oral storytelling or cave painting, or through ceremonial performance. So it's this interesting shift as to how we've always had these various mechanisms of how we express ourselves, but what may have changed is that over time, the ability to express yourself aesthetically through what you wear has shifted from being something that was largely inaccessible to something that is much more accessible now. There are so many helicopters flying around, by the way, and I keep trying to pause this so I can record when they're not flying, but it's been about 7 minutes. I feel like I should check the news because they just keep honestly circling. I feel like I'm fine, but just in case, please call, please text. So what does this mean for us? This is an element of our self-expression that might feel frivolous, but with increased access to expressive clothing, it's something that's not just here to stay, but it'll probably only continue to increase in terms of the size of the industry and the natures in which we see people continue to innovate in their types of expression. It feels almost impossible to dismantle from our core condition, so I think these questions are worth legitimizing because as a society, this is an element of our self-expression that is only going to grow in importance. So, if you are someone who likes to dress a certain way to fit in or to stand out, or to be unique in a certain context and not unique in another, I hope these ideas might help you understand which camps exist and what you might want to do about it moving forward in terms of how you might want to stay there, or shift, or retract, or grow. With that, if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear them. You can reach out to me on Instagram at by.zoom or at the y-intercept. You can also find the transcript for this on Substack, but give me a day because I need to download it all and throw it into ChatGPT to sort out all the punctuation. But other than that, you can also reach out on Twitter at the y-intercept, my website, byzoom.com, and on TikTok and on YouTube, all variations of byzoom. I hope you enjoy the next area in which you get to get dressed. For me, I think it's going to be a headlamp and pepper spray so I can figure out who the hell they're searching for out there because they will not stop swarming. Should I survive, we will chat next time.